The Battle of Midway was a major naval battle in the Pacific theater of World War II that took place on 47 June 1942, 6 months after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and 1 month after the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese combined fleet under the command of Isoroku Yamamoto suffered a decisive defeat by the U.S. Pacific Fleet near Midway Atoll, about 300 mi or 100 mi, 100 km northwest of Oahu. Yamamoto had intended to capture Midway and lure out and destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, especially the aircraft carriers which had escaped damage at Pearl Harbor. Before the battle, Japan desired to extend its Pacific defense perimeter, especially after the Doolittle air raid of Tokyo in April 1942, and to clear the seas for attacks on Midway, Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii. A related Japanese attack on the Aleutian Islands began 1 day earlier on the 3rd of June. The Japanese strike force at Midway, known as the Kid Butai, was commanded by Chuchi Nagumo. Yamamoto's plan for the operation, which depended on precise timing and coordination, was undermined by its wide dispersal of forces, which left the rest of the fleet unable to support the Kid Butai effectively. On the 4th of June, the Japanese began bombing Midway and prepared to wait for the Pacific Fleet to arrive from Pearl Harbor to defend the island. Unknown to Yamamoto, U.S. codebreakers had determined the date and location of his planned attack, enabling the Americans to prepare their own ambush. Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had sent a large force under Frank Jack Fletcher to the Midway area before the Japanese had arrived. Land-based planes from Midway and carrier-based planes from the U.S. fleet surprised and attacked Nagumo's force. All 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kagata, and Hirit, present at the battle were sunk, as was the heavy cruiser Mikuma. Japan also lost 3,000 men, including many well-trained and difficult-to-replace pilots. The U.S. lost the carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, while the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, under the command of Raymond Spruance during the battle, survived the fighting without damage. The Battle of Midway, along with the Guadalcanal campaign, is widely considered a turning point in the Pacific War. After Midway and the attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, Japan's ability to replace its losses in material and trained men became rapidly insufficient, while the U.S.'s massive industrial and training capabilities increased over time. Historian John Keegan called the battle the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare, pre-9/11, while historian Craig Simmons called it one of the most consequential naval engagements in world history, ranking alongside Salamis, Trafalgar, and Tsushima Strait as both tactically decisive and strategically influential. Background: after expanding the war in the Pacific to include Western colonies, the Japanese Empire quickly attained its initial strategic goals of British Hong Kong, the Philippines, British Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, the latter of whose oil resources were particularly important to Japan. Because of this, preliminary planning for the second phase of operations commenced as early as January 1942. Because of strategic disagreements between the Imperial Army IJV and Imperial Navy IJM, and infighting between the Navy's Imperial General Headquarters and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet, a follow-up strategy was not formed until April 1942. High-11 Yamamoto finally won the bureaucratic struggle with a thinly veiled threat to resign, after which his plan was adopted, and 12th Yamamoto's primary strategic goal was the elimination of America's carrier forces, which he regarded as the principal threat to the overall Pacific campaign. This concern was acutely heightened by the Doolittle raid on 18 April 1942, in which 16 United States Army Air Forces, USAAF B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from USS Hornet bombed targets in Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. The raid, while militarily insignificant, was a shock to the Japanese and highlighted a gap in the defenses around the Japanese home islands, as well as the vulnerability of Japanese territory to American bombers. This, and other successful hit and run raids by American carriers in the South Pacific, showed that they were still a threat, although seemingly reluctant to be drawn into all-out battle. Or 14 Yamamoto reasoned that another air attack on Naval Station Pearl Harbor would induce all of the American fleet to sail out to fight, including the carriers. However, considering the increased strength of American land-based air power on the Hawaiian Islands since the 7th of December 1941 attack, he judged that it was too risky to attack Pearl Harbor directly. Instead, Yamamoto selected Midway, a tiny atoll at the extreme northwest end of the Hawaiian island chain, approximately 300 mi 100 mu to 100 km from Oahu. Midway was outside the effective range of almost all the American aircraft stationed on the main Hawaiian Islands. It was not especially important in the larger scheme of Japan's intentions, but the Japanese felt the Americans would consider Midway a vital outpost of Pearl Harbor and would be compelled to defend it vigorously. 9/16 The U.S. did indeed consider Midway vital following the battle, the establishment of a U.S. submarine base on Naval Air Facility Midway Island allowed submarines operating from Pearl Harbor to refuel and re-provision, extending their radius of operations by 200 mi 1900 km. In addition to serving as a seaplane base, Midway's airstrips were a forward staging point for bomber attacks on Wake Island. Yamamoto's plan, typical of Japanese naval planning during World War II. Yamamoto's battle plan for taking Midway, named Operation MI, was exceedingly complex. It required the careful coordination of multiple battle groups over hundreds of miles of open sea. His design was also predicated on optimistic intelligence suggesting that U.S. Enterprise and USS Hornet, forming Task Force 16, were the only carriers available to the Pacific Fleet. During the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier, USS Lexington had been sunk and USS Yorktown suffered so much damage that the Japanese believed she too had been lost. However, following hasty repairs at Pearl Harbor, Yorktown sortied and ultimately played a critical role in the discovery and eventual destruction of the Japanese fleet carriers at Midway. Finally, much of Yamamoto's planning, coinciding with the general feeling among the Japanese leadership at the time, was based on a gross misjudgment of American morale, which was believed to be debilitated from the string of Japanese victories in the preceding months. Yamamoto felt deception would be required to lure the U.S. fleet into a fatally compromised situation. The WWII to this end, he dispersed his forces so that their full extent, particularly his battleships, would be concealed from the Americans prior to battle. Critically, Yamamoto's supporting battleships and cruisers trailed Vice Admiral Echi Nagumo's carrier force by several hundred miles. They were intended to come up and destroy whatever elements of the American fleet might come to Midway's defense once Nagumo's carriers had weakened them sufficiently for a daylight gun battle. T2He tactic was doctrine in most major navies of the time. Unknown to Yamamoto, the U.S. had broken parts of the main Japanese naval code, dubbed JN-25 by the Americans, divulging many details of his plan. His emphasis on dispersal also meant none of his formations were in a position to support the others. 24, for instance, although Nagumo's carriers were expected to carry out strikes against Midway and bear the brunt of American counterattacks, the only warships in his fleet larger than the screening force of 12 destroyers were 2 Kong-class fast battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 1 light cruiser. By contrast, Yamamoto and Kondo had between them 2 light carriers, 5 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and 2 light cruisers, none of which saw action at Midway. The light carriers of the trailing forces and Yamamoto's 3 battleships were unable to keep pace with the carriers of the Kid Butai, Zidon Budoi, mobile strike force, and so could not sail in company with them. The Kid Butai would sail into range at best speed so as to increase the chance of surprise, and would not have ships spread out across the ocean guiding the USN toward it. If the other parts of the invasion force needed more defense, the Kid Butai would make best speed to defend them. Hence the slower ships could not be with the Kid Butai. The distance between Yamamoto and Kondo's forces and Nagumo's carriers had grave implications during the battle. The invaluable reconnaissance capability of the scout planes carried by the cruisers and carriers, and the additional anti-aircraft capability of the cruisers and the other 2 battleships of the Kong class in the trailing forces, were unavailable to help Nagumo 25th Aleutian Invasion main article Aleutian Islands campaign to obtain support from the IJA for the Midway operation. The IJN agreed to support their invasion of the United States through the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, part of the Alaska Territory. The IJA occupied these islands to place the Japanese home islands out of range of U.S. land-based bombers in Alaska. Most Americans feared that the occupied islands would be used as bases for Japanese bombers to attack strategic targets and population centers along the U.S. West Coast. The Japanese operations in the Aleutians, Operation AL, removed yet more ships that could otherwise have augmented the force striking Midway, whereas many earlier historical accounts considered the Aleutians operation as a feint to draw American forces away, according to the original Japanese battle plan. AL was intended to be launched simultaneously with the attack on Midway. A one-day delay in the sailing of Nagumo's task force resulted in Operation AL beginning a day before the Midway attack. Prelude American reinforcements to do battle with the IJN, expected to muster 4 or 5 carriers. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean Areas, needed every available flight deck. He already had Vice Admiral William Halsey's 2 carriers Enterprise and Hornet task force at hand, though Halsey was stricken with shingles and had to be replaced by Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. Halsey's escort commander Pint 27 Nimitz also hurriedly recalled Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's task force, including the carrier Yorktown, from the southwest Pacific area. Despite estimates that Yorktown, damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea, would require several months of repairs at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, her elevators were intact and her flight deck largely so. 29 the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard worked around the clock, and in 72 hours she was restored to a battle-ready state. Thuyik judged good enough for 2 or 3 weeks of operations, as Nimitz required. Thutu her flight deck was patched, and whole sections of internal frames were cut out and replaced. Repairs continued even as she sortied, with work crews from the repair ship USS Vestal, herself damaged in the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, still aboard. Yorktown's partially depleted air group was rebuilt using whatever planes and pilots could be found. Scouting 5 VSV was replaced with Bombing 3 VB3 from USS Saratoga. Torpedo 5 VT5 was replaced by Torpedo 3 VT3. Fighting 3 VF3 was reconstituted to replace VF42 with 16 pilots from VF42 and 11 pilots from VF3, with Lieutenant Commander John Thatch in command. Some of the aircrew were inexperienced, which may have contributed to an accident in which Thatch's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Donald Lovelace, was killed. Bon 34 despite efforts to get Saratoga's, which had been undergoing repairs on the American West Coast, ready. The need to resupply and assemble sufficient escorts meant she was unable to reach Midway until after the battle. On Midway, the U.S. Navy had by 4 June stationed 4 squadrons of PBY's 31 aircraft in total for long-range reconnaissance duties. New Grumman TBF Avengers from Hornets VT-8236V. The Marine Corps stationed 19 Douglas SBD Dauntless, 7 F4F3 Wildcats, 17 Volt SB2U Vindicators, and 21 Brewster 2A Buffaloes. The USAF contributed a squadron of 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 4 Martin B-26 Marauders equipped with torpedoes, in total 122 aircraft. Although the F-2As and SB-2Us were already obsolete, they were the only aircraft available to the Marine Corps at the time. Japanese shortcomings during the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier. The Japanese light carrier Sho had been sunk, and the fleet carrier Shikaku had been severely damaged and was in dry dock for repair. Although the fleet carrier Zuikoku escaped the battle undamaged, she had lost almost half her air group and was in port at the Kure Naval District in Hiroshima, awaiting replacement aircraft and pilots. That there were none immediately available can be attributed to the growing inability of the IJN to properly train pilots faster than they were killed in action. In desperation, instructors from the Yokosuka Air Corps were relieved of their duties to plug the gap. Thus, Carrier Division 5, consisting of the 2 most advanced aircraft carriers of the Kido Butai, was not available, which meant that Vice Admiral Nagumo had only 2/3 of the fleet carriers at his disposal, Kaga and Akoge forming Carrier Division 1 and Hiri and Esri making up Carrier Division 2. This was partly due to fatigue. Japanese carriers had been constantly on operations since 7th December 1941, including raids on Darwin and Colombo, 39 nonetheless. The 1st Carrier Strike Force sailed with 248 available aircraft on the 4 carriers, 60 on Akage, 74 on Kaga, B5N2 Squadron oversized, 57 on Herit and 57 on Sarif. The main Japanese carrier-borne strike aircraft were the HED-3A1 Val dive bomber and the Nakajima B5N2 Kate, which was used either as a torpedo bomber or as a level bomber. The main carrier fighter was the fast and highly maneuverable Mitsubishi A6M0. For a variety of reasons, production of the Val had been drastically reduced, while that of the Kate had been stopped completely, and as a consequence, there were none available to replace losses on 4-1. In addition, many of the aircraft being used during the June 1942 operations had been operational since late November 1941, and although they were well maintained, many were almost worn out and had become increasingly unreliable. These factors meant all carriers of the Kid Butai had fewer aircraft than their normal complement. With few spare aircraft or parts in the carrier's hangars, In addition, Nagumo's carrier force suffered from several defensive deficiencies. It could throw a punch but couldn't take one. A 445 Japanese carrier anti-aircraft guns and associated fire control systems had several design and configuration change deficiencies clarification needed, which limited their effectiveness. The IJN's Fleet Combat Air Patrols Cape had too few fighter aircraft and was hampered by an inadequate early warning system, including a lack of radar. Poor radio communications with the fighter aircraft inhibited effective command and control. The carriers escorting warships were deployed as visual scouts in a ring at long range, not as close anti-aircraft escorts, as they lacked training, doctrine, and sufficient anti-aircraft guns. Japanese strategic scouting arrangements prior to the battle were also in disarray. A picket line of Japanese submarines was late getting into position, partly because of Yamamoto's hasty, which let the American carriers reach their assembly point northeast of Midway, known as Point Luck, without being detected. .46 a second attempt at reconnaissance, using 4-engine H-8K Emily, flying boats to scout Pearl Harbor prior to the battle and detect whether the American carriers were present, part of Operation K, was thwarted when Japanese submarines assigned to refuel the search aircraft discovered that the intended refueling point, a hitherto deserted bay off French frigate shoals, was occupied by American warships because the Japanese had carried out an identical mission in March. Thus, Japan was deprived of any knowledge concerning the movements of the American carriers immediately before the battle. Japanese radio intercepts did notice an increase in American submarine activity and message traffic. This information was in Yamamoto's hands prior to the battle. Japanese plans were not changed. Yamamoto, at sea in Yamato, assumed Nagumo had received the same signal from Tokyo and did not communicate with him by radio, so as not to reveal his position. I-480 These messages were, contrary to earlier historical accounts, also received by Nagumo before the battle began. For reasons that remain unclear, Nagumo did not alter his plans or take additional precautions. U.S. code-breaking Nimitz had one critical advantage. U.S. cryptanalysts had partially broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25B code 50 since early 1942, had been decoding messages stating that there would soon be an operation at Objective, AF. It was initially not known where, AF, was, but Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO were able to confirm that it was Midway. Captain Wilfred Holmes devised the ruse of telling the base at Midway by secure undersea communications cable to broadcast an uncoded radio message stating that Midway's water purification system had broken down, and 51 within 24 hours. The code breakers picked up a Japanese message that AF was short on water, 5-2 feet. The Japanese seemed unconcerned that the Americans were broadcasting uncoded that a major naval installation close to the Japanese was having a water shortage, which Japanese intelligence might have suspected as deception. 53 HYPO was also able to determine the date of the attack as either 4 or 5th June, and to provide Nimitz with a complete IJN order of battle. Japan had a new codebook, but its introduction had been delayed, enabling HYPO to read messages for several crucial days. The new code, which took several days to be cracked, came into use on 24th of May. But the important breaks had already been made. 55 FE. As a result, the Americans entered the battle with a good picture of where, when, and in what strength the Japanese would appear. Nimitz knew that the Japanese had negated their numerical advantage by dividing their ships into 4 separate task groups, so widely separated that they were essentially unable to support each other, and 56 FE. This dispersal resulted in few fast ships being available to escort the carrier striking force, thus reducing the number of anti-aircraft guns protecting the carriers. Nimitz calculated that the aircraft on his 3 carriers, plus those on Midway Island, gave the U.S. rough parity with Yamamoto's 4 carriers, mainly because American carrier air groups were larger than Japanese ones. The Japanese, by contrast, remained largely unaware of their opponent's true strength and dispositions even after the battle began. Battle initial air attacks at about 0900 on the 3rd June. Ensign Jack Reid, piloting a PBY from VP 445080, spotted the Japanese occupation force 509 Mi Fighter 80 Mi 9030 Kamut and to the west-southwest of Midway. He mistakenly reported this group as the main force. The 59 of 9 B-17s took off from Midway at 12:30 for the first air attack. 3 hours later, they found Tanaka's transport group 5070 Nomi 66 Mi 1060 km to the west. Harassed by heavy anti-aircraft fire, they dropped their bombs. Although their crews reported hitting 4 ships, 60 none were actually hit and no significant damage was inflicted. Tan 61 Heen early the following morning. The Japanese oil tanker Akabono Maru sustained the first hit when a torpedo from an attacking PBY struck her around 0100. This was the only successful air-launched torpedo attack by the US during the battle. At 0430 on 4th of June, Nagumo launched his initial attack on Midway, consisting of 36 D-3As and 36 B-5Ns, escorted by 36 Eurofighters. At the same time, he launched his 7 search craft 2 B-5Mans from Akagi and Kaga, 4 HE Evathia J. Keese from the heavy cruiser Tone and Chikuma, and 1 short-range Nakumaye and Dave from the battleship Haruna, an 8th aircraft from Tone launched 30 minutes later. Japanese reconnaissance arrangements were flimsy, with too few aircraft to adequately cover the assigned search areas, labouring under poor weather conditions to the northeast and east of the task force. As Nagumo's bombers and fighters were taking off, 11 BYs were leaving Midway to run their search patterns. At 0534, a PBY reported sighting 2 Japanese carriers. Another spotted the inbound airstrike 10 minutes later. Midway's radar picked up the Japanese at 0553 at a distance of 93 nautical miles, and interceptors were scrambled. Our 63 unescorted bombers headed off to attack the Japanese carriers, their fighter escorts remaining behind to defend Midway. Having taken off at 06 and 064, Midway-based Marine fighters led by Major Floyd B. Parks, which included 6 F-4Fs and 20 F-2As, 6 F-5 intercepted the Japanese at 0660 and suffered heavy losses, though they destroyed 4 B-5Ns and 1 0. Within the first few minutes, 2 F-4Fs and 13 F-2As were destroyed, while most of the surviving US planes were damaged, with only 2 remaining airworthy. Starting at U-6034, Japanese carrier aircraft bombed and heavily damaged the US base. 67 American anti-aircraft fire was intense and accurate, destroying 3 Japanese aircraft and damaging many more. Of the 108 Japanese aircraft that participated in this attack, 11 were destroyed, including 3 that ditched. 14 were heavily damaged and 29 were damaged to some degree. 140 more were available to the Japanese but never launched and were destroyed when their carriers sank. The initial Japanese attack did not succeed in neutralizing Midway. American bombers could still use the airbase to refuel and attack the Japanese, and most of Midway's land-based defenses remained intact. Japanese pilots reported to Nagumo that a second aerial attack on Midway's defenses would be necessary if troops were to go ashore by 7th of June. Having taken off prior to the Japanese attack, American bombers based on Midway made several attacks on the Japanese carrier force. These included 6 Grumman Avengers, detached to Midway from Hornets. VT-8's Midway was the combat debut of both VT-8 and the Avenger Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241's VMSB-24 Win. 3s and 16 SBDs plus 4 USAF B-26 of the 18th Reconnaissance and 69th Bomb Squadrons armed with torpedoes, and 15 B-17s of the 31st, 72nd, and 4th 31st Bomb Squadrons. The Japanese repelled these attacks, losing only 3 Zero fighters while destroying 5 Avengers, 2 SB-2Us, 8 SBDs, and 2 B-26 DOS 77-1. Among the dead was Major Loffen R. Henderson of VMSB-241, killed while leading his inexperienced SBD squadron into action. The main airfield at Guadalcanal was named after him in August 1942. 1 B-26, piloted by Lieutenant James Murray, after dropping his torpedo and searching for an escape route, flew directly down the length of Akagi, while being fired upon by fighters and anti-aircraft fire, which had to hold their fire to avoid hitting their own flagship. The B-26 at Akagi 2 meant 7 3V-74, another B-26 piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays, did not pull out of its run after being seriously damaged by anti-aircraft fire, and instead flew directly at Akagi's bridge, and 7 5V either attempting a suicide ramming or out of control. The plane narrowly missed striking the bridge, which could have killed Nagumo and his staff, crashing into the ocean. 76V. This experience may well have contributed to Nagumo's determination to launch another attack on Midway in direct violation of Yamamoto's order to keep the reserve strike force armed for anti-ship operations. While the air strikes from Midway were happening, American submarine USS Nautilus, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, approached the Japanese fleet, attracting attention from the escorts. Around 0820 she made an unsuccessful torpedo attack on a battleship and then dived to evade escorts. 7A at 0910, she launched a torpedo at a cruiser and again dived to evade escorts, with destroyer Arashi spending considerable time chasing Nautilus. Nagumo's dilemma. In accordance with Yamamoto's orders for Operation MI, Nagumo had kept half of his aircraft in reserve comprising 2 squadrons each of dive bombers and torpedo bombers. The dive bombers were as yet unarmed. This was doctrinal. Dive bombers were to be armed on the flight deck. The torpedo bombers were armed with torpedoes should any American warships be located. At 07:15, Nagumo ordered his reserve planes to be re-armed with contact-fused general-purpose bombs for use against land targets. This was a result of the attacks from Midway, as well as the morning flight leader's recommendation of a second strike. Re-arming had been underway for about 30 minutes when, at 07:40:82, the delayed scout plane from Tone signaled that it had sighted a sizable American naval force to the east, but neglected to specify its composition. Later evidence suggests Nagumo did not receive the sighting report until 08:00. Nagumo quickly reversed his order to re-arm the bombers and demanded that the scout plane ascertain the composition of the American force. Another 40 minutes elapsed before Tone's scout finally radioed the presence of a single carrier in the American force. This was one of the carriers from Task Force 16. The other carrier was not sighted. Nagumo was now in a quandary. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, leading Carrier Division 2 Hiri and S. Wright, recommended that Nagumo strike immediately with the forces at hand 16-3A1 dive bombers on S. Wright and 18 on Hiri, and half the ready cover patrol aircraft. On 85A, Nagumo's opportunity to hit the American ship's 86V was now limited by the imminent return of his Midway strike force. The returning strike force needed to land promptly, or it would have to ditch into the sea. Because of the constant flight deck activity associated with combat air patrol operations during the preceding hour, the Japanese never had an opportunity to position spot their reserve planes on the flight deck for launch. The few aircraft on the Japanese flight decks at the time of the attack were either defensive fighters or, in the case of SORT, fighters being spotted to augment the combat air patrol. ATAF spotting his flight decks and launching aircraft would have required at least 30 minutes. On 89, furthermore, by spotting and launching immediately, Nagumo would be committing some of his reserves to battle without proper anti-ship armament, and likely without fighter escort. He had just witnessed how easily the unescorted American bombers had been shot down. Japanese naval doctrine preferred the launching of fully constituted strikes rather than piecemeal attacks, without confirmation of whether the American force included carriers not received until 08:02. Nagumo's reaction was doctrinaire, and 91th, the arrival of another land-based American air strike as 07s and 53 gave way to the knee attack the island again. Nagumo decided to wait for his first strike force to land, and then launch the reserve, which would by then be properly armed with torpedoes. Had Nagumo instead launched the available aircraft around 07:45 and risked the ditching of Tomonaga's aircraft, they would have formed a powerful and well-balanced force with the potential to sink 2 American carriers. At NI-3, furthermore, fueled and armed aircraft inside the ships presented a significant additional hazard for damage to the carriers in an event of attack, and keeping them on the decks was much more dangerous than getting them airborne. 94. Whatever the case, at that point there was no way to stop the American strike against him, since Fletcher's carriers had launched their planes beginning at 0700s, with Enterprise and Hornet having completed launching by 07:55, but Yorktown not until 09:08, so the aircraft that would deliver the crushing blow were already on their way. Even if Nagumo had not strictly followed carrier doctrine, he could not have prevented the launch of the American attack. Attacks on the Japanese fleet, the Americans had already launched their carrier aircraft against the Japanese. Fletcher, in overall command aboard Yorktown, and benefiting from PBY sighting reports from the early morning, ordered Spruance to launch against the Japanese as soon as was practical, while initially holding Yorktown in reserve in case any other Japanese carriers were found. Spruance judged that, though the range was extreme, a strike could succeed and gave the order to launch the attack. He left Halsey's Chief of Staff, Captain Miles Browning, to work out the details and oversee the launch. The carriers had to launch into the wind, so the light southeasterly breeze would require them to steam away from the Japanese at high speed. Browning, therefore, suggested a launch time of 100, giving the carriers an hour to the Japanese at 25:46 km. This would place them at about 155 miles 287 km, 178 miles from the Japanese fleet, assuming it did not change course. The first plane took off from Spruance's carriers Enterprise and Hornet a few minutes after 0700 to 97 Fletcher, upon completing his own scouting flights, followed suit at 0800 from Yorktown. Fletcher, along with Yorktown's commanding officer, Captain Elliot Buckmaster, and their staffs, had acquired the first-hand experience needed in organizing and launching a full strike against an enemy force in the Coral Sea. But there was no time to pass these lessons on to Enterprise, commanded by Captain George Murray, and Hornet, commanded by Captain Mark Mitcher, which were tasked with launching the first strike. K-99 Spruance ordered the striking aircraft to proceed to target immediately rather than waiting for the strike force to assemble, since neutralizing the Japanese carriers was the key to the survival of his own task force. While the Japanese were able to launch 108 aircraft in just 7 minutes, it took Enterprise and Hornet over an hour to launch 117. 100T Spruance judged that the need to throw something at the Japanese as soon as possible was greater than the need to coordinate the attack by aircraft of different types and speeds, fighters, bombers, and torpedo bombers. Accordingly, American squadrons were launched piecemeal and proceeded to the target in several different groups. It was accepted that the lack of coordination would diminish the impact of the American attacks and increase their casualties, but Spruance calculated that this was worthwhile, since keeping the Japanese under aerial attack impaired their ability to launch a counterstrike. Japanese tactics preferred fully constituted attacks, and he gambled that he would find Nagumo with his flight decks at their most vulnerable. American carrier aircraft had difficulty locating the target, despite the positions they had been given. The strike from Hornet, led by Commander Stanhope C. Ring, followed an incorrect heading of 265 degrees rather than the 240 degrees indicated by the contact report. As a result, Air Group 8's dive bombers missed the Japanese carrier C-11. The 10 F-4Fs from Hornet ran out of fuel and had to ditch. 102. This became known as the Flight to Nowhere. 103 Torpedo Squadron 8 of VT-8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, broke formation from Ring and followed the correct heading. Waldron's squadron sighted the Japanese carriers and began attacking at 0920, followed at 0904 by VF-6 from Enterprise, whose Wildcat fighter escorts lost contact, ran low on fuel, and had to turn back. 102 feet without fighter escort. All 15 TBD Devastators of VT-8 were shot down without being able to inflict any damage. Ensign George H. Gay Jr. was the only survivor of the 30 aircrew of VT-8. He launched his torpedo on SRI before he was shot down, but Surred evaded it and 15 VT-6. Led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene E. Lindsay, lost 9 of its 14 Devastators, 1 ditched later, and 10 of 12 Devastators from Yorktown's VT-3s, who attacked at 10 were shot down with no hits to show for their effort, thanks in part to the abysmal performance of their unimproved Mark 13 torpedoes. 160 feet, the TBD Devastator had shown itself to be unsuitable for modern warfare, and it was to be replaced by the TBF Avenger. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol Flying 018 made short work of the unescorted, slow underarm TBDs. A few TBDs managed to get within a few ship-lengths range of their targets before dropping their torpedoes, close enough to be able to strafe the Japanese ships and force the carriers to make sharp evasive maneuvers, but all of their torpedoes either missed or failed to explode. 199. The performance of American torpedoes early in the war was extremely poor, as shot after shot missed by running directly under the target, deeper than intended, prematurely exploded, or failed to explode at all. 11. Remarkably, senior Navy and Bureau of Ordnance officers never questioned why half a dozen torpedoes, released so close to the Japanese carriers, produced no results. Despite their failure to score any hits, the American torpedo attacks achieved 3 important results. First, they kept the Japanese carriers off balance and unable to prepare and launch their own counterstrike. Second, the poor control of the Japanese Cape meant they were out of position for subsequent attacks. Third, many of the Zeros ran low on ammunition and fuel. 133, the appearance of a third torpedo plane attack from the southeast by VT-3 from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Edward Marcy at 1000, quickly drew the majority of the Japanese Cape to the southeast quadrant of the fleet. 100 better discipline, and the employment of a greater number of Zeros for the Cape might have enabled Nagumo to prevent, or at least mitigate the damage caused by the coming American attacks. By chance, at the same time VT-3 was sighted by the Japanese, 3 squadrons of SBDs from Enterprise and Yorktown were approaching from the southwest and northeast. The Yorktown Squadron VB-3 had flown just behind VT-3 but elected to attack from a different course. The two squadrons from Enterprise, a VB-6 and VS-6, were running low on fuel because of the time spent looking for the Japanese ships. Air Group Commander C. Wade McCluskey, GR, decided to continue the search and by good fortune spotted the wake of the Japanese destroyer Areshi, steaming at full speed to rejoin Nagumo's carriers after having unsuccessfully depth-charged U.S. submarine Nautilus, which had unsuccessfully attacked the battleship Kirishima. 106 Sea-Some bombers were lost from fuel exhaustion before the attack commenced. McCluskey's decision to continue the search and his judgment, in the opinion of Admiral Chester Nimitz, decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. All three American dive bomber squadrons, a VB-6, VS-6, and VB-3 arrived almost simultaneously at the perfect time, locations and altitudes to attack. By 199 most of the Japanese SAP was directing its attention to the torpedo planes of VT-3 and was out of position. Meanwhile, armed Japanese strike aircraft filled the hangar decks, fuel hoses snaked across the decks as refueling operations were hastily being completed, and the repeated change of ordnance meant that bombs and torpedoes were stacked around the hangars, rather than stowed safely in the magazines, making the Japanese carriers extraordinarily vulnerable. Destruction of Koga, Sarite and Akagi beginning at 122. The two squadrons of Enterprise's air group split up with the intention of sending one squadron each to attack Koga and Akagi. A miscommunication caused both of the squadrons to dive at Koga. Recognizing the error, Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best and his two wingmen were able to pull out of their dives, and after judging that Koga was doomed, headed north to attack Akagi. Coming under an onslaught of bombs from almost two full squadrons, Koga sustained 3 to 5 direct hits, which caused heavy damage and started multiple fires. One of the bombs landed on or right in front of the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of the ship's senior officers. Though 121 Lieutenant Clarence E. Dickinson, part of McCluskey's group, recalled we were coming down in all directions on the port side of the carrier. I recognized her as the Koga, and she was enormous. The target was utterly satisfying. I saw a bomb hit just behind where I was aiming. I saw the deck rippling and curling back in all directions, exposing a great section of the hangar below. I saw my 500 230 Club bomb hit right abreast of the carrier's island. The two 100 Alba-45 Kaija bombs struck in the forward area of the parked planes. Several minutes later, Best and his two wingmen dived on Akagi. Mitsuo Fuchida, the Japanese aviator who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was on Akagi when it was hit, and described the attack a look-out screamed, "Hell, Devers!" I looked up to see 3 black enemy planes plummeting towards our ship. Some of our machine guns managed to fire a few frantic bursts at them, but it was too late. The plump silhouettes of the American Dauntless dive bombers quickly grew larger, and then a number of black objects suddenly floated eerily from their wings. Although Akagi sustained only one direct hit, almost certainly dropped by Lieutenant Best, it proved to be a fatal blow. The bomb struck the edge of the mid-ship deck elevator and penetrated to the upper hangar deck, where it exploded among the armed and fueled aircraft in the vicinity. Nagumo's chief of staff, Right Nosuke Kusoka, recorded, "Terrific fire. Bodies all over the place, planes stood tail up, belching livid flames and jet black smoke, making it impossible to bring the fires under control." WAF 24, another bomb exploded underwater very close Aston. The resulting geyser bent the flight deck upward in grotesque configurations and caused crucial rudder damage. Simultaneously, Yorktown's VB-3, commanded by Lieutenant Max Leslie, went for a Sarite, scoring at least 3 hits and causing extensive damage. Gasoline ignited, creating an inferno, while stacked bombs and ammunition detonated. I-123 VT-3 targeted Hirit, which was hemmed in by Asarat Kaga and Akagi but achieved no hits. Within 6 minutes, Esso Rate and Kaga were ablaze from stem to stern. Akagi, having been struck by only one bomb, took longer to burn, but the resulting fires quickly expanded and proved impossible to extinguish. She too was eventually consumed by flames and had to be abandoned. Although Nagumo was reluctant to leakage, Hull 27 Samik was able to persuade him in 128-129 Akadan 46. Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. 1/3 out, all 3 carriers remained temporarily afloat, as none had suffered damage below the waterline, other than the rudder damage to Akagi caused by the near-miss close Aston. Despite initial hopes that Akagi could be saved or at least towed back to Japan, all three carriers were eventually abandoned and scuttled. 1006 NB-30, while Kaga was burning, Nautilus showed up again and launched 3 torpedoes at her, scoring 1 dud hit. Kaga was later sunk by the Japanese destroyer Hajikes. Japanese counterattacks Hirite, the sole surviving Japanese aircraft carrier, wasted little time in counterattacking. Harry's first attack wave, consisting of 18 D-3As and 6 Zeros, followed the retreating American aircraft and attacked the first carrier they encountered, Yorktown, hitting her with 3 bombs, which blew a hole in the deck, snuffed out all but one of her boilers, and destroyed 1 anti-aircraft mount. The damage forced Fletcher to move his command staff to the heavy cruiser Astoria. Damage control parties were able to temporarily patch the flight deck and restore power to several boilers within an hour, giving her a speed of 19 kNs, 35 kbh, 22 MIF, and enabling her to resume air operations. Yorktown hoisted a flag signal to indicate a speed of 5 knots. 1:33 Captain Buckmaster had his signalman hoist a new 10 by 15-foot American flag from the foremast. 13 D-3As and 3 Zeros were lost in this attack. 2 Zeros turned back early after they were damaged attacking some of Enterprise's SBDs returning from their attack on the Japanese carriers. Approximately 1 hour later, Harry's second attack wave, consisting of 10 B-5Ns and 6 escorting Zeros, arrived over Yorktown. The repair efforts had been so effective that the Japanese pilots assumed that Yorktown must be a different, undamaged carrier. 135 feet they attacked, crippling Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. She lost all power and developed a 23-degree list to port. 5 B-5Ns and 2 Zeros were shot down in this attack. News of the 2 strikes, with the mistaken reports that each had sunk an American carrier, greatly improved Japanese morale. The few surviving aircraft were all recovered aboard Hirite. Despite the heavy losses, the Japanese believed that they could scrape together enough aircraft for one more strike against what they believed to be the only remaining American carrier. American counterattack late in the afternoon. A Yorktown scout aircraft located Hirite, prompting Enterprise to launch a final strike of 24 dive bombers, 6 SBDs from VS-6, 4 SBDs from VB-6 and 14 SBDs from Yorktown's VB-3. Despite Harry being defended by more than a dozen Zero fighters, the attack by Enterprise and orphaned Yorktown aircraft launched from Enterprise was successful. 4 bombs, possibly 5, hit Hirite, leaving her ablaze and unable to operate aircraft. Hornet strike, launched late because of a communications error, concentrated on the remaining escort ships but failed to score any hits. Both 139A, a bomb from the Enterprise dive bomber piloted by Dusty Clyce, struck Hirite on the bow, essentially crippling her. After futile attempts at controlling the blaze, most of the crew on Hirite were evacuated, and the remainder of the fleet continued sailing northeast in an attempt to intercept the American carriers. Despite a scuttling attempt by a Japanese destroyer that hit her with a torpedo and then departed quickly, Hirite stayed afloat for several more hours. She was discovered early the next morning by an aircraft from the escort carrier H-Show, prompting hopes she could be saved or towed back to Japan. Soon after being spotted, Hirite sank. Yamaguchi, along with ship's captain Tomio Kaku J. chose to go down with the ship, costing Japan perhaps its best carrier officer. One young sailor reportedly tried to stay with the officers but was denied. As darkness fell, both sides made tentative plans for continuing the action. Fletcher, obliged to abandon the derelict Yorktown and feeling he could not adequately command from a cruiser, ceded operational command to Spruance. Spruance knew the U.S. had won a great victory, but he was unsure of what Japanese forces remained and was determined to safeguard both Midway and his carriers. To aid his aviators, who had launched at extreme range, he had continued to close with Nagumo during the day and persisted as night fell. Finally, fearing a possible night encounter with Japanese surface forces 142, he, and believing Yamamoto still intended to invade, based in part on a misleading contact report from the submarine Tamba 143, Spruance changed course and withdrew to the east, turning back west towards the Japanese at midnight. Taiwan Fifohi for his part. Yamamoto initially decided to continue the engagement and sent his remaining surface forces searching eastward for the American carriers. Simultaneously, he detached a cruiser raiding force to bombard the island. The Japanese surface forces failed to make contact with the Americans because Spruance had briefly withdrawn eastward, and Yamamoto ordered a general withdrawal to the west. A 155 It was fortunate for the US that Spruance did not pursue had he come in contact with Yamamoto's heavy ships, including Yamato, in the dark, considering the Japanese Navy's superiority in night attack tactics at the time. There is a very high probability his cruisers would have been overwhelmed and his carriers sunk. Spruance failed to re-establish contact with Yamamoto's forces on the 5th of June, despite extensive searches. Towards the end of the day, he launched a search and destroy mission to seek out any remnants of Nagumo's carrier force. This late afternoon strike narrowly missed detecting Yamamoto's main body and failed to score hits on a straggling Japanese destroyer. The strike planes returned to the carriers after nightfall, prompting Spruance to order Enterprise and Hornet to turn on their lights to aid the landings. At 02:05 Fefaju, Commander John Murphy's Tamber, lying 90 Nomisa 100 meet west of Midway, made the second of the submarine force's two major contributions to the battle's outcome, although its impact was heavily blunted by Murphy. 1 Fu A sighting several ships. Neither Murphy nor his executive officer, Edward Spruance, son of Admiral Spruance, could identify them. Uncertain of whether they were friendly and unwilling to approach any closer to verify their heading or type, Murphy decided to send a vague report of 4 large ships to Admiral Robert English, Commander, Submarine Force, Pacific Fleet. This report was passed on by English to Nimitz, who then sent it to Spruance. Spruance, a former submarine commander, was understandably furious at the vagueness of Murphy's report, as it provided him with little more than suspicion and no concrete information on which to make his preparations. 109 Hei, unaware of the exact location of Yamamoto's main body, a persistent problem since the time PBYs had first sighted the Japanese. Spruance was forced to assume the 4 large ships reported by Tamber represented the main invasion force, and so he moved to block it while staying 100 miles 190 km, 120 miles northeast of Midway. In reality, the ships sighted by Tamber were the detachment of 4 cruisers and 2 destroyers Yamamoto had sent to bombard Midway. At 02:55 these ships received Yamamoto's order to retire and changed course to comply. 150 at about the same time as this change of course, Tamber was sighted, and during maneuvers designed to avoid a submarine attack, the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma collided, inflicting serious damage on Mogami's bow. The less severely damaged Miquelfion's 22 Kibech, 14 muff to keep pace, off 151. Only at 04:12 did the sky brighten enough for Murphy to be certain the ships were Japanese, by which time staying surfaced was hazardous, and he dived to approach for an attack. The attack was unsuccessful, and around 0600 he finally reported 2 westbound Mogami-class cruisers before diving again and playing no further role in the battle. 103 limping along on a straight course at 12 knots, roughly 1/3 their top speed. Mogami and Mikuma had been almost perfect targets for a submarine attack. As soon as Tamber returned to port, Spruance had Murphy relieved of duty and reassigned to a shore station, citing his confusing contact report. Poor torpedo shooting during his attack run, and general lack of aggression, especially as compared to Nautilus, the oldest of the 12 boats at Midway, and the only one which had successfully placed a torpedo on target, albeit a dud. Over the next 2 days, several strikes were launched against the stragglers, first from Midway, then from Spruance's carriers. Mikuma was eventually sunk by Dauntlesses, 152 while Mogami survived further severe damage to return home for repairs. The destroyers Arashio and Asashio were also bombed and strafed during the last of these attacks. 153 Captain Richard E. Fleming, a U.S. Marine Corps aviator, was killed while executing a glide bomb run on Mikuma and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Meanwhile, salvage efforts on Yorktown were encouraging, and she was taken in tow by fleet tug USS Vireo. In the late afternoon of 6th June, the Japanese submarine I-168, which had managed to slip through the cordon of destroyers, possibly because of the large amount of debris in the water, fired a salvo of torpedoes, 2 of which struck Yorktown. There were few casualties aboard since most of the crew had already been evacuated, but a 3rd torpedo from this salvo struck the destroyer USS Hamman, which had been providing auxiliary power to Yorktown. Hamman broke in 2 and sank with the loss of 80 lives, mostly because her own depth charges exploded. With further salvage efforts deemed hopeless, the remaining repair crews were evacuated from Yorktown. Throughout the night of 6th June and into the morning of 7th June, Yorktown remained afloat, but by 05:30 on 7th June, her list rapidly increased to port. Shortly afterward, the ship turned onto her port side. At 1:55 at 07:01, Yorktown capsized and sank. Japanese and US casualties. SBD pilot Norman Dusty Cleese, who scored 3 hits on Japanese ships during the Battle of Midway as the aircraft carriers Kaga and Hirit and heavy cruiser Mikumov, wrote, "From the experience in the Marshalls, at Wake and at Marcus, I thought our fleet learned its lessons. We could not send TBDs into action unless they had adequate smoke protection and torpedoes that exploded more than 10% of the time." By the time the battle ended, 3057 Japanese had died. Casualties aboard the 4 carriers were Kage 267, Kaga Ada Lelawan, Hiratin 392 including Yamaguchi who chose to go down with his ship, Sori, Sei including Captain Yanajimoto who chose to remain on board, a total of 200 Iwen 157E. The heavy cruiser sunk 700 casualties and Mogami badly damaged. 9-2 accounted for another 792 deaths. In addition, the destroyers Arashio's Bomb 35 and Asashio's strafed by aircraft. 21 were both damaged during the air attacks which sank Mikuma and caused further damage to Mogami. Float planes were lost from the cruisers Chikuma Elsthrud and Tonels Toof. Dead aboard the destroyers Tanike's 11 Arashia 1, Kazago no 1 and the fleet oiler Ekbonomaru's Hunter have made up the remaining 23 casualties. At the end of the battle, the US lost the carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Haman. 307 Americans had been killed, including Major General Clarence L. Tinker, commander, 7th Air Force, who personally led a bomber strike from Hawaii against the retreating Japanese forces on the 7th of June. He was killed when his aircraft crashed near Midway Island.